Thank you everyone for joining us today for this virtual venture cafe. We're going to give a talk and then do an art making demonstration. But first, I really would like to thank the Venture Cafe team and the St. Louis Art Museum's marketing department for all their work in organizing this event when it was in person and now getting us all into this virtual space. They've been really wonderful, so thank you all. So my name's Hannah Clem, and I'm joined in the first part of this presentation by Molly Moog, and we will be discussing the work of Elias Sime, which will be featured in an upcoming exhibition, Currents 118 Elias Sime, that Molly and I curated at the St. Louis Art Museum. After our presentation, Kira Hageman will be leading everybody in an art project that's inspired by Elias's work. That'll be very exciting, so hopefully everyone can stick around for that too. And then at the end, we're going to leave some time for questions. So if you have questions during the presentations, please feel free to put them into the comment box. I think that's what we have the best access to. So at the end, we'll kind of go through and try to answer as many questions as we have time for. And yeah, okay. So we're going to start. Let me see if I can make sure my PowerPoint's moving forward. Nope. There we go. So Elias Sime is an internationally recognized contemporary artist from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And over the past decade, he's become really well known for his large-scale modular artworks that were made from electrical wires, transmitters, cell phone components, computer keyboards, and motherboards, really the sort of detritus of technology and its history. So here's a picture of Elias. He's standing in his studio. And he's standing in front of two in-process artworks here. So you can see that he makes these works through these kind of component parts. And what he does is he takes these pieces of collage material and he cuts them or breaks them, weaves them, and we'll look at more close-ups so you can actually see how these things work, and then attaches them to uniform shaped boards. And then these boards get collaged together in almost a mosaic. So it's kind of a two-part collage experience with Elias's work. And he calls them tableaus, the large finished product. And what's interesting about how he works is he always works on the ground like that. So the works he lays out and he moves the different pieces around or kind of constructs them in various arrangements. But then when they're installed in a gallery, they become on the wall. And it's usually the first time he's ever seen them installed that way because they are gigantic. We actually, when I say large scale, I'm not kidding. We use this slide as kind of an example. I think the tallest one in our show will be about 16 feet high, 14 to 16 feet high. And so they're very, very large. And so they come together in all of these pieces to create the final composition. Sime was born in 1968 and lived through many important political shifts in Ethiopia. And he actually attended art school starting in 1986 at the tail end of the communist dictatorship of the Derg Party. And he was trained in the style of socialist realism, as was common of the time. But he graduated in 1990. So his schooling really encompassed this fundamental shift as the Berlin Wall fell, as the Iron Curtain fell, and as monumental change came to both Ethiopia and really the world in general. So while in art school, he worked in this very figurative manner, but it wasn't necessarily something he was that driven by as an artistic style. Rather, he was interested in the materiality. So after art school and when kind of pursuing his own art practice as an individual artist, he started really working with collage and abstraction and making these kind of more expressive works. And he would wander around the city and think about different materials, and he was influenced by objects that he found just around in Addis, in his house. So it was buttons, yarn, plastic, and a lot of bottle tops and bottle parts. So you can see the very bottom, there's a little circle in the image, that's a bottle cap. And for a while, what he did is he signed his collages with this pressed bottle cap that became kind of part of his work. Starting in around 2008, he became really interested in using kind of the elements of discarded technology. And he found these at this place, which is the Merkato, an open air, sort of a large market in Addis. It's the largest market of this kind in all of Africa. And there's sections of the market that are actually called the anything you want sections. And it's just piles of stuff, of keyboards, of motherboards, of old disused cell phones, things that you buy. And he started amassing these elements of technology. And in 2008, he began a series that he continues today. And actually a lot of his works are still part of and considered part of this series called Tightrope, where he specifically uses these cast off parts of technology. And according to Sime, for him, tightrope initially referred to the precarious balance or tension he saw that a city navigated in the face of rapid urban development, in particular this moment in Africa in the 1990s. But since then, he's really expanded this idea to capture what he sees as a sort of incalculable role of technology in ordering modern life. And Sime's materials, as well as his artworks, as hopefully you'll see as we move through all of these slides, they tell a story of globalization, of an interconnected world. And his projects really transform these formerly functioning objects into something completely new and allow them to transcend their original utilitarian purpose.
Thanks, Hannah. So in 2018, Elias Sime created a mural for the Facebook headquarters in California as part of their Artist in Residence program, which is what we're looking at here on this slide. The design looks like a redwood tree and was inspired by Elias Sime's visit to the California redwoods during his site visit to Facebook to examine the site for the commission. So what you see here are interwoven lines that are made of pieces of broken up circuit board as well as computer keys. And they form a sort of mosaic surrounded by these sections of braided wire that are nailed down to the wall. So to Sime, the roots and the bark of the redwood trees that he saw in California resembled woven fibers. And so for his Facebook commission, he used the woven roots of a tree to represent this idea of interconnectivity and these ties that bind people together throughout periods of technological development and change. So this work, this Facebook commission, is really a good example of how natural themes and images are central to Sime's work, even when he's dealing, like Hannah was talking about, with very technological materials and concepts. And this work that we're looking at here, Tightrope Noiseless 1, is a work from Sime's Tightrope series that's going to be in our St. Louis exhibition that combines natural and geometric shapes, and it's both painterly and sort of sculptural in its composition. So at top of the image, we have these sort of twisty shapes that actually resemble seaweed, like seaweed flowing in the water, or paintbrush strokes, for example. And these pieces, it's hard to see in this image, but they're actually made from pieces of broken circuit board and surrounded by sections of braided wire. Hannah, can you do the close-up? So you can see a little better here. And below, there are these grids of circuit board with geometric components that really stick up from the surface, adding a lot of dimensionality to the work. And also hanging down are cables and wires that echo these twisting sort of seaweed forms at the top of the image.
So just to keep building on these ideas of a combination of sort of natural and man-made materials, of this juxtaposition of technology and nature, here's another work that he's made entirely out of woven wire. So this will also be at in the exhibition at the St. Louis Art Museum. And this kind of woven wire practice is very common with Sime's tableaus, and he takes the wire and he takes multiple wires and will weave them and kind of braid them into a single thicker, composite of multiple wires. And he learned this particular kind of braiding technique from the women in his community. It's a traditional Ethiopian hair braiding technique. And then what he does is he takes the wires and kind of creates these structures, this kind of movement, and then nails them down. So you can see these tiny little black dots when in the close-up, and those are little nails that he uses, and they kind of both punctuate the composition, and as you walk back from a distance, they become invisible and kind of wash into the wires. And with these wires, he creates these kind of more natural, kind of undulating movement pieces that I always think sort of mimic water. This one I see kind of algae pools on top of a surface, but these aren't actual phenomenon. They're not actual places, as you'll see with some of these things. It's always this kind of greater idea of what nature is and its relationship to human life. And for Sime, nature is a site that is always representative of humans' interaction with it or even intervention in it, that there's nothing always pure about it. And so he likes to create these kind of tensions. And the other thing that's so interesting about him, about the way these works are kind of compiled, is sometimes it takes him years to get enough wire of certain colors that he can actually make what he considers a finished tableau. And certain colors are harder to find than others. He says there's this particular rusty copper color that's always really hard to find. It's not in as much material anymore. So he builds these pieces over a long period of time, depending on how much of a material he can find. So here's another work that also kind of showcases this natural phenomenon. These are kind of like icebergs or ice flows on water, but they're made out of computer keyboards. So I'll show you a close-up so you can see the difference in textures. And you can also see how he somehow sometimes constructs these tableaus across the different squares. So sometimes he'll envision them as, you know, an overall composition and kind of trace it out. And sometimes, like with some of the wire works, he pieces them together at different moments. So there's a lot of different ways in which he conceives these large scale objects.
So this is Tightrope Noiseless 8. It's another work from his Tightrope series that's going to be in the St. Louis Art Museum exhibition. And what we see here are actually grids of this green circuit board that are really quite lustrous when you see them in person. And from this distance, it almost looks like a monochrome painting. But Hannah, will you do the next? But when you look close, these circuit boards are separated by these very thin, sort of wavy rivulets of black plastic that are almost like waves and interrupt the hard edge geometry and grid of the overall work. Next. Another work from Sime's Tightrope series is Tightrope Noiseless 11. And many of Sime's abstractions, like this work, can actually be read or seen as a landscape seen from above or from an aerial perspective. And in this work, you can see these beige circuit boards and computer keys, which look from this distance like a grid of buildings and streets that are crossed by these streams of braided brown and gray wire. You have a close-up too, right? Yeah. And although this work resembles a map, it doesn't actually represent a specific or real location. Instead, in works like these that resemble maps, what Sime is actually doing is he's really exploring the aesthetics of these aerial viewpoints and how we associate them with technologies like satellite imaging, airplane flight, Google Maps, and these technologies that cross vast distances and connect people on a global scale.
So Sime's studio art, which is what we've been discussing with the works that are in exhibitions or that will be in our upcoming exhibition, only represents one component of his multifaceted practice. And in 2019, he co-founded Zoma Museum, which is what you see here, or part of what you see here, in his hometown of Addis Ababa. He did this with his curator and anthropologist, kind of collaborative partner, Mesferem Azagad. And Zoma is a manifestation of Elias and Meski's idea about art's ability to impact society. It's comprised of a school, a farm, a library, a herb garden, a cafe, and an exhibition space. And the aim was to merge art with community engagement and sustainability. And it sits on 4 acres in the Merkato neighborhood of Addis. And so it's actually in the city. It's this kind of oasis within this urban area. So Sime and Meski designed the Zoma buildings using a traditional Ethiopian method and materials of building known as wattle and daub, which is this form of kind of mud and dirt and hay that gets dried out and baked and made into these kind of clay walls, which is the brown that you can kind of see in the buildings. Yet they adapted it for contemporary purposes. And the walls and the designs were made by Sime, and they're decorated with natural textures and patterns. There's areas with insects. There's a part that shows butterflies, because for him, that kind of metamorphosis was part of the building of Zoma. But he wanted to use the patterns that he put into the building to reinvigorate this ancient technique and really make it contemporary and make it art in itself. So that for him was very much the pushing forward of this technique into the moment and into the future. So here's a really beautiful shot where you can see a lot of the textures that he got out of the buildings. And his studio is based here. They have an art school for children. It's a pretty incredible place. And in 2018, before it was even opened, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed, came to visit Zoma in its, building stages. And the next day after his visit, he called Elias and Meski and invited them to do something that was really quite amazing, which was to design a large public garden for the Menelik Palace in Addis Ababa, which is going to become known as the community garden. This palace has a long symbolic history in Ethiopia, having served as a nexus of power for the leaders of the past. And the current prime minister decided to open up this palace and make it a public space and have it serve as a community center for the people of Addis and really the world. And it will be the first time that the public will be allowed in the palace since 1976. So here's a working process photo of part of the garden. So Elias is working again in a very similar manner as Zoma, of thinking about how to decorate these stones and these walls, but maintain the integrity of aspects of the architecture and the movement through space. In the midst of designing the gardens at Menelik, Elias and Meski actually decided to come out to St. Louis because they really love site visits for their exhibitions, like Molly was talking about with the Facebook Commission. And on December 26th, the day after Christmas, they came out for one day because they were in between all these meetings with the prime minister and getting the garden going. So they came to St. Louis for one day, and they had a few things on their list they wanted to see. And it was an abnormally warm day. I think it was like 65 degrees in December in St. Louis, which is not normal. And the first request when I picked them up at 9 a.m. was to go out to the Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site to view the historic mounds of the pre-Columbian Native American city that sits directly across the Mississippi River, about 15-20 minutes from St. Louis. They were incredibly interested in these mounds, in part because they both have a historic interest in mound culture, and they were telling me about these, that Ethiopia has its own historic mound culture. And for example, this one is the one that doesn't say Cahokia. I never know which left and right you guys have. That one is an example of mounds from the Central Highlands that were built between the 8th and 15th century in Ethiopia. And they really are interested in these histories of indigenous cultures around the entire globe. Also, as we've discussed, Sime is very just interested in making visual connections across spaces and places and seeing how things interconnect. So I think Cahokia Mounds for him was a space where he could see this kind of really long human history. The other site that they wanted to visit was the Gateway Arch, which he absolutely loved. And I think he's still a little upset that we weren't able to get tickets to go up to the top. It was sold out on the day after Christmas, but someday we'll come back and do it. But the arch and the mound became these two incredible points of inspiration for new works that came out of the show. And so he called us a few weeks after getting back and said that he was going to make new works for the St. Louis Art Museum exhibition, and that they, for the first time really, were going to be freestanding sculptures.
Yeah, so like Hannah mentioned, freestanding sculpture is sort of a new element of Sime's work. He's made a few, but not many. So this is really exciting to have this new aspect of his work that we're going to be able to show in St. Louis. And here you can see a photograph of the two new sculptures from Sime's studio in Ethiopia. It's an in-progress photograph. And what you see here are actually the undersides of the sculptures, which look like domes. And you see them covered in these patterns that are actually made out of this braided wire that's nailed down. But when they're going to be shown at the St. Louis Art Museum, they'll look different. They'll actually be flipped over like a bowl to reveal the interior surface of the structure, which will be patterned all over with these technological components, almost like a mosaic on the inside. And like Hannah was mentioning, this flipped dome or bowl shape is sort of an inversion of the forms of these ancient earthen mounds that Sime was so interested in when he visited St. Louis and Cahokia Mounds, as well as a sort of reference to this iconic catenary arch shape of the Gateway Arch. So like Hannah mentioned, Sime was really just fascinated by the Cahokia Mounds and their material connections to Ethiopia's own ancient mound culture, but also to these earthen architecture techniques like wattle and daub that are used to make Zoma. And this is really just one example of how Sime's interest in global phenomena and interconnections extends beyond technology to these histories of art and architecture, as well as global systems of communication and exchange. So we're really looking forward to unveiling these finished sculptures in St. Louis. And now I'm going to hand this off to our colleague, Kira, who's going to lead us in a really fantastic art activity.
You're still muted.
I forgot to unmute myself. I was saying thank you, Hannah and Molly. It was so great to see that work. I'm so excited to see it in St. Louis. And thank you again to everyone for being here. So as Molly mentioned, I wanted to share a project that draws on some of the ideas and methods that we saw in Elias Sime's work. So I wanted to come back to a couple images that were in the PowerPoint. And as you're looking at these, I would encourage you to think about some of the things that stand out to you, maybe things that you're curious about or really excited about, and kind of hold on to these and ideas and images for inspiration that you can use in your own work. So a couple of the things that stood out to me are the ways that he uses these everyday, discarded, kind of often overlooked materials, and then recontextualizes them into these really intricate compositions that give kind of new and different life to the materials and take your mind in all sorts of different places. So there was this idea of maps and landscapes, natural environments, figures, all sorts of things. And then another thing that stands out to me is the idea of interconnectivity that we heard a lot in the presentation, and thinking about kind of your relationship to other people, to the materials you have around you, to the environments we live in, and how all of these things are connected globally, and then thinking about how we communicate with one another. So we thought that that would be a good starting point for a project you can do at home. So I think we can stop sharing now, Hannah, and I'll show you kind of a close-up. Thanks. So we thought you could use some of the materials that you have on hand around to collage a postcard. And so collage is really the idea of taking lots of parts of materials and combining them to make a new whole. And so you can collage the postcard, and then you can go ahead and write a message on it and send it to someone. So it's kind of nice to also think about like a non-digital way we can communicate with all of this digital communication that we're doing. So as we saw in Sime's work, one of the great things about collage is you can kind of use whatever material you have around. So oftentimes we think about photographs and book pages and things like that. But you could really use anything that you're willing to cut up that you don't mind kind of repurposing into an artwork. So a couple of things that I found that I thought were fun. I think we have a lot of recycling and kind of trash around. And so I have thought these LaCroix cans are nice because they're really colorful on the outside, and then you also have this silver on the inside, so it's kind of a two-sided thing. And I found that if I just cut the top off with a knife or X-Acto knife, then they're super easy to cut into. So it's very thin metal, and you can just go ahead and cut right into it. And I like to cut out this middle part, and then you basically have what's like a sheet of paper made out of metal. And so you can cut different shapes out of that. And then they're nice and thin and easy to glue on to whatever canvas you have. A couple other things I found, I discovered in my home all of these rolls of film that I had developed at some point. And so I thought, I don't know where I would develop them now, but they're kind of an interesting material. They've got, you know, that color, they've got an interesting perforation, and some of those ghost images. Some other fun things, sometimes you lose parts of a deck of cards or something, so I was excited to find these troll cards that you could cut up. Other things that, you kind of pile up sometimes are like appliance manuals, and so I discovered that inside they tend to have some really great graphics or text that could be really fun to use in a collage. And then some other, like things like junk mail that you just have lying around and you're not quite sure what to do with it, or like clothing catalogs. I think sometimes they look like they're not that interesting, but as you open up pages, you can find that there's often like textures that you can isolate, colors or natural materials. So I discovered that as I was looking for materials for this, I started to see potential in kind of everything around my house, and it was kind of fun to go into boxes and closets and spaces that I hadn't looked in a while and reconnect to some memories. So I think it's interesting just thinking about how all those things are connected. And I would encourage you to have some fun exploring your home and see what you can find and what you might want to turn into your own artwork. So once you have your materials, then you can get started with your collage. And so I'm going to tilt my screen down so that you can see a little bit better. Hopefully that glare is not too bad. Okay, so the first thing that we need to be able to make the collage is the base to make it on. And I found kind of like a pizza or something, you want a sturdy enough base that you can fit a variety of toppings on it. And so one material that I found that worked really well is manila folder. It's nice and neutral and it's not super thick, but it's sturdy enough to glue on top of. But if you don't have a manila folder around, really any kind of cardboard box would work. Well, like a thin cardboard. So this is a cereal box, but you could use, you know, like a waffle box or LaCroix box or something like that. And I kind of like to get rid of measuring whenever possible. So I found a postcard that I used as a template, and I thought that was a really good size because then you can keep with this idea of a postcard. It kind of references nature sometimes. And I like this idea of like the history of kind of non-digital communication. So I'm using this as a template, and I'm just gonna go ahead and trace it. But if you don't have a postcard, you could use an index card. A 4x6 photograph is about the same size as a postcard, or you could just go ahead and measure it. So the nice thing about the template is that you can make a lot of these really quickly, so you could send out a whole bunch. And then I'm just gonna go ahead and cut it out. And so now you basically have a postcard that's ready to go. And one of the things that you'll probably notice is that you'll have this brown side that's kind of dark, so it might be a little dark to write on. And then you also have the side that has whatever the box kind of outside was. And so I went ahead and covered mine with just some copy paper. And I actually covered both sides because I wanted a blank canvas. But you might find that you want to use either this colored side or the brown side in your artwork, in your collage, and that's fine too. You could pretty easily incorporate it in. So once you've got your base set, this is the fun part, is when you get to play with the materials that you have. I think I'm going to use this manila one, actually. And as I mentioned, collage is really a process of combining different parts into a new whole. And so one of the fun things that's really fun about it is the ways that new ideas and images come as you put these different elements together and kind of different relationships form. So there's a couple ways you could go about starting. One would be you could draw out a design that you like, and you could think of it more like a paint by number and kind of fill in those spaces. And so I know I want these floral elements to be in the front, the foreground. So I started filling in the background so that I can just layer these on top and I don't have to kind of awkwardly cut around that shape. But another thing that could be fun is you could just kind of start cutting things and let the materials guide you. You could look for cool patterns or textures or shapes that you like and start to cut them out. So I started cutting out a few. And I find sometimes you can kind of lay them out as you're working to help figure out what you want to do. I think I'll cut out a few more. And as I was preparing for this, I did a little bit of research. I looked online and I found some interviews where Elias talked about how he doesn't always have his end goal totally in mind, but he lets the process of making and working with the materials help guide the process. So that could be a really great way to start working on your own collages as well, kind of to see what happens. I think I like the background in this image, so I'm gonna cut a little more. And another thing, if you don't have scissors, you can always tear pieces too, and you get that nice perforated edge on there. Oh, that one didn't work so well, but. So as you're working, one of the great things about collage too is that you can continue to layer on top of things. So you might decide that you want to put images next to each other, side by side. You might want to layer them on top of one another. So you could lay them out before you glue, or you could start gluing and continue to lay them on top of each other. And I've been using just a glue stick. I think it's not too messy, and you can usually find them pretty easily at a grocery store. But if you don't have a glue stick, there's lots of other things you could use. So there's school glue, which I think there's some glare on that. There's also tacky glue, which would be really good if you've got some heavier materials. Any kind of tape would work. And one thing that's kind of cool, if you have junk mail envelopes, you can cut off the adhesive in the unused envelopes, and then it basically becomes like a strip of tape. So you can get it wet, and then you can place it down, or you can even loop it and put it under an image so you can't see it. So I'm gonna start gluing. And as you're working, there's some things you could think about, like whether you wanna have a certain color scheme, whether you want it to be really busy or kind of more subdued, if you want to leave some background space, or you want it to be kind of all covered. I tend to like to cover all of my space. Or you could draw on some of the images we saw today for inspiration. So I'll do just a little bit more. And I thought I'll show a can piece just to get an idea of that too. I think the heavier glue for any kind of three-dimensional or heavier element would be good for kind of a school glue or a tacky glue if you can get it open. No. And then you can just glue it on. So I think it can be kind of meditative. You can have a lot of fun with it. I'm gonna let that dry, but I thought I would show a few other examples just so you can see some of the other materials that I worked with. So this is the one we saw in the beginning. And this is some of those film strips. And then these are barcodes from a can. And I found a calendar piece that I kind of liked those perforations. A couple of other things. This one, though, it's pretty complete. I still think it's in process. So I thought it was a nice example of how you can continue to layer things. So I think of more of this as a background or kind of like an underpainting that you can build on top of. Another one that, even though this is really busy, I still think it's fairly in process. I'm not quite happy with it. Like it's a little hard to see on here, but I wanted to play with some things like beads, some of these can materials, and again, thinking about kind of that dimensionality that we saw in some of Sime's work, but also keeping in mind that you don't want it to be too thick because we're going to send it through the mail. And then a couple other ones, these are a little more finished. You can think of it a little bit more mixed media. So I think I've been thinking about rooms a lot, I guess, naturally, because we're at home. And then another thing we saw in the talk was that there was a lot of braiding that Sime does in his work. And so that's another technique you might want to use. If you've got some string or yarn, even some wires, you could try it out and you can braid them and then integrate them into your composition how you like. So once you've got your finished product, as I mentioned, you could write a letter to it and send it to somebody as a little work of mail art. And this size is, it can go through the mail. It's technically a postcard size, so you could send it just as is. But because we glued all these materials on, I think there's a lot of danger that it might not make it safely in the mail. So what you could do is you could just put it in an envelope, or if you don't have any envelopes on hand, you can easily make your own as well. So this is just from a magazine page, and I went and put a little paper on it to make a label as well. And so what I did was I Googled envelope template and found a PDF. And so if you have a printer, you could print this off. Otherwise, you could use it as a guide. And then it can become a template just like before. So you could place it on your magazine page and trace it. And then you get this kind of cool template, and it usually tells you where the top and the bottom is. And then you can glue up your sides. And you have an envelope. And you put your postcard in and you can send it off to someone. And the thing that's kind of fun about that is then the envelope becomes a work of art too. So you could even collage the envelope, which is fun. So that was the idea with that. I think we still have a little bit of time for questions, but I hope that this gives you some inspiration for making some of your own work. And if you do make some stuff, we would love to see it. So feel free, if you post it online, to tag us at STL Art Museum. You could also tag Venture Cafe or Elias Sime if you wanted to show him that you were inspired by his work. So I think, as Hannah and Molly mentioned, there's some time now for questions. If you wanted to type your questions into the chat box, then we can go ahead and try to answer some of those. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Kira. Yeah, I don't see any questions yet. Oh, we just got
Here
one.
we have one.
Okay.
Frank is interested to learn how SLAM and the presenters use new strategies to showcase collections during the pandemic. If you had to, could you or would you digitize Sime's work?
Well, we have images, as you saw, and I think a presentation like this is a great example of how we're continuing to promote upcoming exhibitions. There's obviously also a lot of copyright issues with contemporary art, so we can't just use anything we want any way we want. But yeah, we're absolutely trying to do as much to get images out to everybody. And like everybody keeps saying, you can go to SLAM's Instagram, has a really lovely program of digital images. And we're going to continue to try to get as much information to people as we can through these different programs and through the museum in general. Oh, Pat, one of our wonderful our head of marketing is actually saying that there will be a blog post coming out. So I guess we're allowed to say that. We wrote a blog, so we will be giving you more information about Sime. Obviously, this is just, we could have probably talked the whole 45 minutes about Sime's work, but Kira's art project is so cool. I hope many of you guys do it. I also think it's great. It's not just, I think it's non-age specific. It made me want to go collage things, to be honest.
Yeah, but the blog will be great because Hannah shares some really interesting insights about Elias Sime and Meske's trip to St. Louis and some of the things that they experienced and some of their inspirations for some of the work that's going to be in the show. So definitely recommend checking that out.
Any other questions?
I'm not seeing any more. Oh, we have one from Jade.
Hi, Jade. How many works, Jade asked us, how many works will be at the exhibition in SLAM? This is terrible of me. I used to have all these facts on my literal tip of my tongue. I think it's 11.
11 is what I remember. 11 works.
And many of them are new. I think 6 of them are new. The show took an amazing, really wonderful serendipitous turn after the visit, and he went back to Ethiopia and just started making works and made so many more new works than we really expected, and finished pieces that had been in progress. And then the 2 sculptures are really interesting and cool objects. So
Hannah, we had another question from Pat about how many works Elias Sime creates each year. I don't know the answer to that.
No, it's interesting because he actually is quite prolific, but the reason is in part because he's usually working on 10 to 15 works at a time. I know that's true. And since Zoma kind of opened and he has a huge amount of space, and he actually works with a lot of students and people who come through the Zoma school as studio assistants to help with some of the collecting of materials and collaging of materials, he's become even more prolific, to be perfectly honest. So he makes quite a number of works. We witnessed him make about 6 works in 4 months. But it's about this volume of works in process. So a work can take 3 years and a work can take a month. It totally depends.
And kind of as you were mentioning, Hannah, in the presentation, he's constantly collecting these materials and thinking about how to use them. So that's sort of a whole nother process of the work, that he's thinking about the kind of materials he'll need even before he begins to create. And yeah, we had a question about when the museum will reopen. And I think we had a slide, Hannah. Did you want to share it with some information about that? But there are resources on the website that anyone in the talk can consult to see that.
Yeah, we can have this up.
Yeah, so we'll have information there to update all our visitors about when the museum's planning to reopen.
And we put this image on there just so that you can really see the dimensionality, because that's something that is so interesting about these works. And I think Kira was kind of talking about it with the can, is that you can really, there's sometimes a huge amount of dimensionality to the pieces. Sometimes there's things that jet out of as much as 2 inches off of the surfaces of these boards. So they have a really beautiful surface quality to them.
And it also allows you to see the braiding technique, how that's secured with these tiny little nails that you can kind of see on that right side of the image.
Any other, Molly, are there any other, do you see any other questions?
I don't see any more questions.
Oh, there's one.
Oh, we have a question about the Elanatsui. Someone asked about the big sort of piece that is made out of pieces of bottle caps that is hanging in the Taylor Hall, the entryway to the East Building at the St. Louis Art Museum. That's a work by an artist named Elanatsui.
Molly, did you want to say anything about the connections, or?
Yeah, he's also an African artist who actually Sime gets, sometimes his work does get compared with Anatsui, because Anatsui is also using found materials that some people would consider refuse, such as bottle caps and elements of cans, and really repurposing them and bringing out the beauty in something that's incredibly mundane. So our work that we have at SLAM is made out of pieces of bottle caps that are sort of folded almost into like a little bead and sort of strung together into this gorgeous sort of shimmering tapestry that we also have a sort of a little bit of a license of how we install it. So that's kind of interesting, because we have the ability to bring out different sort of patterns and different luster by the way that it drapes along the wall. So that's a really fantastic work as well. It's definitely a favorite.
As there was another question about, does Elias have a favorite material that he likes to work with? Elias?
He's never really talked about it, but the one absolute consistency is the wires, and I think it must be a very driving force in the practice. He's never really, at least in my conversations with him, he's never privileged one thing over the other. And I know some materials are more difficult than others. The kind of green and cream motherboards that we showed in some of those works are really hard to actually break and shape and get to lay down the way he wants. So they can be a bit of a struggle, but they give off such a beautiful texture and luster that he loves working with those. But the wire is so consistent, and he's been doing so much with these full wire pieces that are gorgeous, but also very time consuming because it's just so much wire. So people are braiding wire all the time in his studio.
Another thing that I find kind of interesting is that he's not just interested in any kind of technological refuse. He's very specific that he thinks of these things as art materials. So for example, he loves those old kind of computer keys. If you had like an original Mac, those old beige keys, but he's not so much interested in a lot of the computer keys that people use now, or some kinds of cell phone components he doesn't find quite as beautiful. So it really is, you know, quite important to him, the qualities of the materials that he looks for.
And it's interesting because at the beginning, when his works were getting a lot of attention, there was obviously a lot of talk about the idea of like recycling, of it being this commentary on e-waste. And he really stood back against that. And he doesn't like the term recycle. He likes the term reuse. So he thinks of these things as a rebirth, as giving objects a new life as art after their use as technology. And for him, the trace of these objects, of everything they've been and everywhere they've been, from their making, through their use, through their discarding, through their, reuse as art, is part of that process for him. There's something very interesting and kind of uniquely spiritual in a way about the way he talks about these things versus a kind of just straight political commentary. Not that that's not there. He's very aware of the problematics of e-waste and especially in Africa and Ethiopia, and the dumping of waste. But this for him is a small way to repurpose things and give them an entirely new existence.
Hannah, we've had a request to just flip through a few of the slides. Would you mind just kind of going back a bit to show some of the images?
So these two are actually older works that aren't in the exhibition. They're just older works. We've had many, you know, we do these presentations and sometimes it's nice to show the arc. So I think you can kind of see also some of his growth and what he's doing now and how it differs a little from some of the older works. Here are the mounds again, and these, as Molly was explaining, are just covered with this woven wire, and they're huge. They're like 7 feet wide, I think. So they're very big, and they're really impressive.
Hannah, we've had another question about communicating with Elias Sime and how that was, and I think you can obviously talk about Meski, and then also about some of the highlights from his visit.
Oh yeah, I guess I'll take communicating literally. So Meski.
Yeah, so someone was asking about his, you know, how it was. Is he an English speaker, and how communication went? So sorry.
No,
to clarify.
I can't see the comments anymore now that
Yeah.
I'm watching, probably because I don't know what I'm doing. It's probably not real, but thank you, Molly. So yeah, he doesn't speak English. So Meski has also become his translator, and she went to college in the US for a while. So she's very fluent, and she studied anthropology, and then she was a curator in Addis, and she met Elias while he was showing early on in his career, and they became kind of creative partners. And with the new works and the community-based works such as Zoma, they're completely equal partners in it. But then Elias still has his own art practice. But when he travels to these shows and when he does work, even with the galleries, she functions as his translator. He speaks more English than he lets on, and he understands a lot. So, you know, there is a sense of communication, and you can really kind of tell what he talks through her, but he talks to you as well. And their visit was really wonderful. So they flew in late at night on Christmas. And then I met them in the morning on the 26th, and they flew out. I dropped them off at the airport at 6 o'clock. So we had from about 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. to be in St. Louis. And it's because the palace was in the process of its final days of being finished. So they were in between meeting Saudi princes and the Prime Minister of Germany to give them tours of the palace, because the palace has become this amazing international phenomenon. So the Prime Minister wanted them back. They actually claimed it was Christmas and family that they were leaving instead of the museum. So they were here, but the Cahokia Mounds was really their primary stop. And Meski personally has a long interest, even more than Elias, in historic mounds, and she's traveled all over the US to look at these ancient pre-Columbian sites. So she'd been wanting to go to Cahokia for a long time. So that was something that was really important to them. And then the arch was a little, I think, of a tourist thing, but they both, like everyone, myself included, who's not from St. Louis, they fell in love with it because it is an absolutely stunning piece of sculpture. And so it was interesting because I think they kind of went thinking, oh, we've got to see this. And then we were there for a long time, and Elias was just taking pictures of every angle of the arch that he could find. And I promised if they ever come back, we'll make sure to have tickets to go up to the top. And then we spent time at the museum, obviously. But it was interesting because there were things he wanted to see outside of the museum. I think art is important to him, but the world is really important to him as much as anything.
We've had another question. Can you elaborate on how his cultural relationships with Native American art, in particular the Cahokia Mounds artwork? I think the question's about his relationship with Cahokia Mounds.
I think this was it was a place he wanted to visit. There was not a preconceived notion of Cahokia Mounds. Meski had told him it exists, and he really wanted to go. I think it's part of a longer practice for him of being interested in kind of the history of human creation, as Molly was saying.
And I mean, I think another interesting thing to note, as you've mentioned, Hannah, is that Meski is an anthropologist, and something that Meski and Elias do is travel around Ethiopia, for example, and to look at art traditions around Ethiopia. And so they're very interested in this. This is a regular part of Elias's practice, is to do these kinds of visits.
Yeah, absolutely. But I don't think he was. He was so interested, and it did influence the sculptures. But he's interested in these sites everywhere he goes.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of their research into Zoma and the history of Ethiopia itself came out of these kind of deep dives into ancient history of building techniques, of art techniques. So it's something that he's interested in globally. Well,
Thank you, everyone.
thank you everyone so much for joining us.